Carl Jung, the Swiss psychiatrist and thinker who spent the better part of his long life exploring the deeper layers of the human mind, wrote extensively about what he called the unconscious. He believed, with great conviction and meticulous attention, that a vast portion of who we are exists outside our ordinary awareness, that beneath the self we present to the world, beneath the self we believe ourselves to be, there moves a deeper current, rich, complex, and containing everything that consciousness has chosen not to look at directly. He called one central aspect of this hidden interior the shadow. The word carries certain associations: darkness, concealment, something lurking. But Jung meant something much more precise and much less dramatic than these associations might suggest. The shadow, in his understanding, is not a monster beneath the surface. It is simply the part of ourselves that we have not yet met, or have met, and then looked away from. It is the collected residue of everything we could not comfortably acknowledge about ourselves, placed quietly in an interior room and left there, not because we are dishonest or cowardly, but because being human requires a kind of ongoing editing. We cannot hold all of ourselves in full view at all times. Consciousness is selective by necessity, and so, inevitably, things get left behind. Jung was not the first person to notice this. Philosophers and poets have long sensed that the self is divided, that what we show the world and what we carry privately are not always the same. But Jung gave this division a name, a structure, and a significance that transformed the way many people came to understand themselves. This reflection is an invitation to spend some time with these ideas. Not to resolve anything, not to arrive at conclusions, simply to sit with the landscape of the psyche as Jung understood it, slowly, without urgency, to consider what the shadow might contain, to notice, with some gentleness, how it moves in ordinary life, and to understand, perhaps for the first time, or perhaps a little more deeply than before, why the quiet hours often bring us face to face with aspects of ourselves that the daylight keeps at a comfortable distance. The room is dark, the body is still, and somewhere in the layers of the self, something that has waited patiently is quietly beginning to stir. Before we move further into these ideas, it is worth pausing for a moment to acknowledge the quality of attention that they invite. These are not ideas that reward urgency. They do not yield their meaning to the kind of focused, problem-solving attention that a complex task at work might require. They are more like landscapes than puzzles. They are to be moved through slowly, with a certain willingness to let the meaning accumulate gradually, rather than arrive all at once. Jung himself was a slow thinker, in the best sense. His writing moves deliberately, returning to ideas from different angles, circling them, illuminating them from adjacent directions, before approaching them directly. There is a quality in his work that matches, in some ways, the quality of the hours we are now inhabiting. A preference for depth over speed, a willingness to sit with uncertainty while the understanding develops at its own unhurried pace. We are in no hurry tonight. The night is long, and the ideas we are exploring do not need to be finished. They need only to be entered, and then perhaps carried forward into whatever comes next, whether that is sleep or simply the quiet continuation of wakefulness in a room that has grown entirely still. Let us begin with something familiar, the way certain memories return when the mind is unoccupied, a moment of embarrassment from years ago, a word spoken carelessly to someone you cared about, a decision made in haste whose consequences unfolded slowly over time. These memories are not random, though they can feel that way. They carry a particular texture, a slightly uncomfortable quality, the sense, vague but persistent, that they are unfinished in some way. This is something that nearly everyone recognizes. The late-night mind is, among other things, a curator of the unresolved. It returns to what has not been fully processed, not to torment, not to punish, but because the psyche has its own relationship with time that differs considerably from the one the conscious mind prefers. The conscious mind, in its ordinary functioning, tends toward forward momentum. There are things to accomplish, decisions to make, a self to maintain and project. It moves through experience with purpose and selectivity, gathering what is useful and setting aside what is not. This is not dishonesty. It is simply how consciousness manages the density of lived experience. If we held every moment equally in awareness at all times, we would be paralyzed. The selection is necessary. But what gets set aside does not disappear. This is the central insight that Jung spent decades elaborating, and it has implications that extend far beyond the consulting room where he first developed his ideas. Material that consciousness has set aside does not dissolve into nothingness. It remains in another register of the mind, and it continues to exert influence. Sometimes the influence is subtle, a vague unease, a recurring pattern in relationships, a tendency to react with unexpected intensity to certain situations. Sometimes it is more visible, surfacing precisely in the quieter hours when the editing functions of the conscious mind are less active. The memories that return at night, the half-thoughts that unspool as sleep approaches, the feelings that settle without explanation into the body during stillness. These are among the ways the deeper mind communicates with consciousness, not in the sharp, declarative language of rational thought, but in something more oblique, more associative, more honest. Jung had a word for this layer of the mind that persists beneath consciousness: the unconscious. And it is important to understand what he meant by this, because the word can sound more mysterious than it needs to. The unconscious, in Jung's understanding, is not a mystical realm. It is simply the portion of the mind that operates outside our direct awareness. It includes everything from the automatic processes that keep the body functioning without our attention, to the repository of memories and emotional associations that have been set aside by conscious experience, to something even deeper and more collective, which we will return to later. The personal dimension of the unconscious, the part that is yours specifically, is shaped by everything you have experienced and everything you have had reason to suppress, ignore, or move away from. It includes the embarrassments and the regrets, the impulses considered and then withdrawn, the feelings deemed too large or too inconvenient for the moment in which they arose. All of these accumulate, not as burden exactly, but as depth, as the unacknowledged complexity of a personality that has been shaped by living. When the mind revisits old thoughts in the dark hours, it is not simply being unruly. It is following the slow current of its own deeper logic. The psyche is attempting to do something, to return to what was set aside, to circle it, to examine it from a new angle. Whether or not we cooperate with this process is, in some sense, what the whole of psychological life is about. There is something to be noticed here, without any urgency. The thoughts that come back, the faces that surface, the old conversations that replay, they are not random visitors. They are, in some way, part of the self that is asking for a different kind of attention. Not the anxious, effortful attention of a mind trying to solve problems, but the quiet, receptive attention of a mind willing simply to acknowledge what is present. This acknowledgement does not require understanding. It does not require resolution. It requires only a certain quality of presence, the willingness to sit with something without immediately needing to change it. Outside, the night continues its slow movement. Somewhere, a light passes across a wall and disappears. The breath continues its ancient rhythm, steady and unhurried. The body settles a little further into its resting position, and the mind, if left to its own unhurried pace, finds its way toward something that might, if attended to with patience, begin to clarify itself. There is also this to consider: the very fact that certain memories return, that certain feelings arrive uninvited in the quiet hours, is evidence that the inner life is doing something, that there is a process underway, deeper than conscious choice, that has its own momentum and its own direction. People sometimes speak of the sleeping mind as passive, as a place where one is simply absent from oneself until morning. But the experience of late-night wakefulness, of the half-awake state in which consciousness is soft at its edges and the interior becomes more accessible, suggests something different. The mind does not switch off. It shifts register. It moves into a different mode of processing, one that is less selective, less goal-directed, more associative. And in that mode, different things become available. The thoughts that arrive at the edge of sleep are often the truest thoughts of the day. Not true in the sense of being accurate about the external world, but true in the sense of being unedited, of carrying the actual texture of how things feel, rather than the managed version that ordinary consciousness prefers. The slight anxiety about a relationship that daylight hours keep at a comfortable distance. The longing that has no clear object but is unmistakably present. The sense that something in the life is not quite right, or that something is quietly good, or that a question which has not yet been asked is nonetheless forming somewhere beneath the level of language. This is the borderland that we are inhabiting together, the edge between the known self and the deeper self. It is a territory worth spending some time in, with curiosity rather than anxiety, with openness rather than the desire for resolution. What surfaces here is not the problem of the self. It is the self, in more of its fullness than the daylit hours usually allow. Carl Gustav Jung was born in 1875 in a small Swiss village, the son of a Protestant minister whose own struggles with faith would later influence Jung's thinking considerably. He became a psychiatrist in an era when the field was still young, still forming its vocabulary, still deciding what it was and what it could claim to understand. He worked initially with Sigmund Freud, a relationship of enormous mutual influence and eventual significant rupture, and he spent the decades that followed developing a framework for understanding the psyche that in many ways went much further than Freud was willing to go. Where Freud tended to focus on the personal history of the individual, on the specific repressions and experiences that shaped a particular life, Jung became increasingly interested in patterns that seemed to recur across individuals, across cultures, across centuries. He read mythology, alchemy, comparative religion, anthropology, the literature of ancient civilizations that had nothing obvious in common with modern European thought, and everywhere he looked, he found the same underlying structures, the same recurring images, the same fundamental tensions. He began to develop the idea that the human psyche carried not only a personal history, but a collective one. That beneath the individual unconscious lay something even deeper, which he called the collective unconscious, a shared reservoir of human psychological experience expressed through universal images and patterns he called archetypes. But we will return to the collective later. For now, it is enough to understand something about the personal layer. The personal unconscious, and specifically the portion of it that Jung called the shadow. Jung observed, through decades of clinical work and personal reflection, that every person carries within them a collection of traits, impulses, memories, and potentials that have been pushed outside the boundaries of conscious identity. The process by which this happens is neither sudden nor deliberate. It begins in childhood, as a child learns what is acceptable and what is not, what earns warmth and what earns withdrawal, what can be expressed freely and what must be hidden if the child is to remain connected to the people and the world upon which survival depends. Every culture, every family, every social context has its own set of rules about what kind of person is acceptable. Some emotions are welcomed. Others are greeted with discomfort or punishment. Some qualities are praised. Others are shamed. A child who is praised for gentleness may learn to suppress the less gentle impulses that are also part of their nature. A child who is rewarded for confidence may learn to conceal the fear that is equally real. A child raised in an environment that values control may lose access to spontaneity. The losses are not total. They are more like relocations. The suppressed material moves from the daylit rooms of consciousness into the deeper areas that Jung was mapping. And so the shadow forms, not as something foreign, but as something familiar. It is made of the self, entirely of the self, but it is the portion of the self that could not, for whatever reason, be included in the conscious identity that the individual was constructing. Jung described this with characteristic precision and a certain unhurried gravity. He understood the shadow not as something to be ashamed of, but as something to be understood. In his view, a person who had no awareness of their own shadow was not a more virtuous person than one who did. They were simply a less complete one. And this incompleteness had consequences, both for the individual and for the people around them. The shadow does not cease to exist simply because it is not acknowledged. It continues to operate. It influences choices, reactions, relationships, the quality of inner life. It is, in Jung's memorable phrase, the thing a person has no wish to be. Not because it is monstrous, but because it is inconvenient. Because it contradicts the image of the self that consciousness has so carefully assembled. Understanding this is not a cause for distress. It is, on the contrary, a cause for a kind of quiet relief. The strange thoughts that sometimes surface, the impulses that seem to come from nowhere, the reactions that feel disproportionate, that surprise even the person having them. These are not signs of something wrong. They are signs of something human, of a psyche that is larger than any conscious account of it can capture, of a self that is genuinely complex. This is the beginning of what Jung called self-knowledge, not the kind that comes from introspection alone, from simply thinking carefully about who we are, but the kind that comes from a genuine willingness to consider what might exist at the edges of awareness, what might be there, moving quietly, in the portions of the mind that consciousness has not fully explored. The room is still. The quality of darkness around you is familiar and safe. Whatever you are carrying into this quiet hour, it belongs to a life that is richer and more layered than any single day of it suggests. And somewhere within that richness, the shadow waits, not threateningly, patiently. There is something worth dwelling on here before we move further. Jung was not writing about a rare or exceptional psychological condition when he described the shadow. He was writing about the ordinary, universal structure of every human mind. The shadow is not evidence of something unusual about the person who has one. It is evidence, on the contrary, of the most thoroughly ordinary thing imaginable, which is that they are a human being living within a social world, navigating the requirements of belonging and acceptance, shaped by the particular family and culture and historical moment into which they were born. Every such person has a shadow, without exception. The only variable is the degree to which the shadow has been acknowledged and brought into relationship with consciousness. Jung himself was not excluded from this. He was, perhaps, more honest about it than most. He spent decades examining his own psychological depths with a rigor and an honesty that few people have brought to self-examination. And he emerged from that examination not with a clean and transparent self-knowledge, but with a deepened appreciation for the sheer inexhaustibility of the inner life. There was always more. There was always another layer. There was always, somewhere in the deeper register, something that had not yet been fully seen. This is not cause for discouragement. It is cause, perhaps, for a kind of quiet wonder. The self is genuinely large. It exceeds any account of it. And the shadow is one of the primary ways in which that largeness makes itself felt. If we try to imagine the shadow as a kind of interior room, we might find it considerably more varied in its contents than the word shadow implies. It is not primarily a room filled with darkness and danger. It is more accurately a room filled with complexity, with the accumulated residue of everything that did not quite fit into the identity that consciousness has been constructing over a lifetime. Some of what the shadow contains is admittedly uncomfortable. The impulses that a person has considered and then firmly set aside. The anger that was never appropriate to express. The envy that felt too shameful to acknowledge. The selfishness that contradicted a carefully maintained self-image of generosity. The moments of cruelty, however fleeting, that reminded a person of something in themselves they would prefer not to see. These things exist in almost every psyche, not as evidence of fundamental wrongness, but as evidence of the full and complicated reality of being a person navigating a world with other people in it. But the shadow contains much more than this, and this is something Jung was at considerable pains to emphasize. Because the common misunderstanding is that the shadow is simply the repository of the bad, the dark, the socially unacceptable. And while it is true that suppressed negative impulses find their way there, so does much else. suppressed creativity belongs to the shadow. In a life where practicality was required, where art was considered indulgent or impractical, the creative impulse may have been pushed aside early and thoroughly. A person who grew up in an environment that did not value imaginative expression may have developed a conscious identity as someone who is simply not creative. And yet, somewhere in the deeper layers of that person, the creative life is still present, waiting, occasionally surfacing as an inexplicable longing, or as an unusual intensity of feeling when encountering art or music, or as a vague and persistent sense that something important has been left unlived. Vulnerability, too, often finds its way into the shadow. In a world that values strength and self-sufficiency, the acknowledgement of genuine need can feel dangerous. Many people learn early that to need something from others is to invite disappointment or rejection, or worse, the loss of the regard that they depend upon. And so they construct an identity that emphasizes independence, capability, the appearance of not needing. But the vulnerability does not disappear. It moves into the shadow, where it continues to exert its influence, often emerging in ways that feel mysterious, in the unexpected sadness that visits at odd moments, in the disproportionate pain of minor rejections, in the longing that surfaces, unexplained, at the edge of sleep. The shadow may also contain aspects of personality that were discouraged not because they were negative, but because they did not fit the role the person was cast in. A child who was the responsible one in a family may have suppressed a genuine capacity for playfulness and spontaneity. A person who was told, explicitly or implicitly, that they were not particularly intelligent may have pushed their intellectual curiosity into the shadow. Someone raised to be humble may have suppressed genuine ambition, genuine confidence, a genuine sense of their own worth. This is one of the more counterintuitive aspects of Jung's understanding. The shadow can contain gold, things of genuine value that have not yet been claimed, precisely because they were at some earlier stage too dangerous to claim. Culture and society play a substantial role in shaping what enters the shadow. Every culture has its own particular account of what a person should be. What qualities are admired? What qualities are suspect? Gender, to take only one obvious example, has historically demanded the suppression of vast ranges of human experience. Men have been taught to suppress tenderness, uncertainty, the whole emotional register that is considered incompatible with the social performance of masculinity. Women have been taught to suppress ambition, anger, the forms of assertiveness that are considered incompatible with the social performance of femininity. These suppressions leave deep marks on the psyche. They shape identity by exclusion as much as by inclusion. And then there is what Jung called the persona, the mask, the face presented to the social world. Every person develops a persona. It is not dishonesty, it is adaptation. The persona is the set of qualities, attitudes, and behaviors that allow a person to function in the social world, to meet its requirements, to earn its approval. It is the professional self, the social self, the self that knows what to say at dinner parties and when to laugh, and how to appear sufficiently composed under pressure. The persona is not false, but it is selected. And everything that was not selected, that could not be included in this social presentation, tends to move over time, into the shadow. The persona and the shadow are, in a sense, each other's inverse. The shadow contains what the persona cannot afford to show. This is why it is possible to be both genuinely kind and genuinely cruel, genuinely generous and genuinely selfish, genuinely confident and genuinely terrified, not as contradiction, but as complexity. The shadow holds the half of the equation that consciousness has decided not to own. And that decision, however understandable, has its consequences. There is nothing alarming in this. Understanding that the shadow exists and contains these things is already, in some small way, a form of integration. Awareness is not action. Recognition is not transformation. But it is the beginning of something. A certain quality of honesty with oneself that, when sustained over time, changes the texture of inner life in ways that are gradual and real. The night continues around you. The breath continues its slow tide. Whatever is present in your own interior is simply present. It does not need to be categorized or evaluated right now. It simply needs, in this quiet hour, a certain permission to exist. It is worth sitting for a moment with the specific textures of what might be in your own shadow. Not as an exercise in self-examination, not as a project to be undertaken and completed, but simply as a gentle noticing. Are there qualities in yourself that you are uncomfortable acknowledging? Not the large, dramatic ones, but the smaller and more ordinary ones. The capacity for pettiness that surfaces occasionally, unwelcome, in reactions to minor frustrations. The streak of competitive feeling that appears in situations where generosity would be more consistent with your self-image. The satisfaction, admitted or not, when someone whose success you have envied experiences a setback. These small and very human responses are not evidence of moral failure. They are the ordinary contents of a shadow that belongs to a person who is genuinely trying to be good, and who, like every such person, finds the trying occasionally more complicated than the aspiration. The shadow also contains, as we noted, the unrealized and the unlived, the life that was not taken, the paths that were not followed, the creative work that was deferred or abandoned, the version of the self that never quite got the conditions it needed to fully develop. These are not necessarily sources of regret. They are simply part of the psychological reality of a person who has lived a specific life with specific constraints and specific choices. The fact that they are in the shadow does not make them lost. It makes them available, potentially, for a different kind of attention, for the slower, more interior kind of exploration that the shadow, when approached honestly, makes possible. The night holds all of this. Every complexity, every unlived path, every familiar and unacknowledged impulse. It holds them quietly and without judgment. This is something the night has always been good at. Of all the ways the shadow makes itself visible, projection is perhaps the most reliable and the most instructive, and it is also, in the ordinary course of life, the most difficult to recognize in oneself, precisely because it operates through the apparent observation of other people rather than through the examination of the self. Projection, in Jung's understanding, is the mechanism by which the contents of the unconscious are experienced as belonging to the outside world rather than to the inner one. What is inside is perceived as outside. What is unacknowledged in the self is attributed with great confidence, and often with genuine emotion, to someone else. This can take many forms, but the clearest signal, the one Jung returned to most often, is the quality of intense negative reaction to another person. Not ordinary dislike or reasonable objection, but something more visceral. The quality of being genuinely disturbed by someone in a way that seems out of proportion. The person whose presence creates an unreasonable irritation. The person whose behavior inspires a degree of contempt that surprises even the one feeling it. The person who seems, in some hard-to-articulate way, to be a kind of affront, to embody something that triggers an unusually sharp response. Jung's insight was that this intensity is informative, that it often points not toward a simple flaw in the other person, but toward something in the observer that has not been fully acknowledged. The quality that so powerfully disturbs us in another person is very frequently a quality that exists in ourselves, pushed into the shadow, and therefore experienced, when it appears in the external world, as something that belongs entirely to that other person. This can be uncomfortable to sit with, as ideas go. The person who reacts with disproportionate irritation to what they perceive as arrogance in others may be carrying a suppressed arrogance of their own. The person who cannot tolerate weakness in others may be defending against an unacknowledged fear of their own vulnerability. The person who condemns dishonesty with unusual intensity may be managing a shadow that contains a considerable capacity for self-deception. The projection, in each case, is a way of keeping the shadow out there rather than in here. None of this means that the other person is therefore fine, that their behavior is without genuine issue, that the projection renders the observer entirely wrong in their assessment. People do behave badly. There are real arrogances, real dishonesty, real cruelties in the world that warrant clear-eyed recognition. The question is not whether the quality exists in the other person. It may well exist. The question is about the intensity of the reaction, and what that intensity might be pointing toward in the one who is reacting. Projection also operates in positive directions, though this is discussed less often. The idealization of another person, the tendency to project exceptional qualities onto someone, to see in them a perfection or a completeness that exceeds the evidence, is also a form of projection. Here it is the golden shadow, the unacknowledged strengths and potentials that belong to the self, that are attributed to someone else. The person in whose presence one feels inadequate or diminished. The person who seems to embody a quality that one longs for deeply, without quite knowing why. This too can be a signal, a message from the deeper self about something that has been placed outside the boundaries of conscious identity. Not because it is negative, but because it felt at some point too presumptuous to claim. The mirror that other people hold up to us is, in this sense, one of the more important sources of self-knowledge available to the observing mind. Not because what it shows us is simply a reflection of ourselves, not because every conflict reduces to an interior drama with the other person merely playing a role, but because the particularly charged moments, the particularly intense reactions, often carry within them a kind of information that a more directly introspective approach might miss. There is a particular quality to projection that makes it both useful and difficult. When we project something onto another person, the experience is of remarkable clarity. We see them clearly. We understand them. We know what they are. This sense of certainty, of transparent understanding, is itself one of the signals. Because genuine perception of another person tends to be much more uncertain, more complex, more open to revision. It is when we feel we have someone absolutely clear and understood, particularly when that clarity is unflattering, that the shadow may be most actively at work. To consider the possibility of projection is not a form of self-blame. It is not a requirement to retract every perception, every criticism, every observation of others. It is simply a gentle willingness to ask, when the intensity seems notable, whether something in this reaction might be showing me something about myself as well as about the person I am reacting to. The question itself, held lightly and without insistence, is already the beginning of a different kind of seeing. The quality of stillness around you is considerable now. The mind, following its own slow current, may be pausing at a face or a memory, at someone whose presence has, at some point, created an unusually charged response. There is nothing that needs to be done with this. Only noticed if it is there, allowed to be what it is, which is simply interesting, simply information from a deeper level of the self, offered without urgency in the quiet of this particular hour. It is also worth reflecting on the other side of this process, because projection is not the only way in which other people serve as mirrors for the shadow. There is also the phenomenon of what might be called shadow recognition, the particular quality of immediate understanding that sometimes arises in the presence of another person. The sense, which can be surprising in its speed and its depth, of seeing something familiar in someone else. Not the comfortable familiarity of a shared background or a similar personality, but something deeper. The recognition of a quality in another person that one has reason to know intimately, because it is a quality that one carries oneself in the less acknowledged portions of the self. This recognition can be the basis for genuine connection. Two people who recognize each other's shadow, who sense in each other the complexity that ordinary social presentation usually conceals, often discover a quality of understanding between them that feels different from more surface-level connection. It has a depth, a certain honesty, that arises from the mutual acknowledgement of complexity, from the unspoken recognition that each carries more than they typically show. The shadow, then, is not only a site of internal psychological work, it is also, when its influence is understood, a potential source of the kind of genuine human connection that goes below the surface, the connection that becomes possible when two people, however briefly and however partially, stop performing their personas for each other and allow something more interior to be present. These are among the moments that people remember longest. The conversations that happened in the dark hours, the exchanges that felt unusually real, the connections that touched something that ordinary social life rarely reaches. There is something deeply understandable about the desire to be seen as good. Not simply to be good, but to be seen as good. The desire is not vanity, or not primarily vanity. It is something more ancient and more elemental, something rooted in the basic conditions of human social life, which has always been a life of interdependence, of belonging, of needing to be acceptable to the group in order to survive within it. A human being is not designed for isolation. The need for connection, for belonging, for the acceptance of others is not a luxury or a weakness. It is fundamental to the nature of the species. And this means that the regard of others matters enormously, has always mattered enormously, in ways that are written very deeply into the psychology of every person who has ever lived. And so the desire to appear good, to present a self that meets the expectations of the social world, that earns warmth and acceptance, and the sense of belonging that comes with being considered a person of quality. This desire is simply human. It is the desire to be included, to be safe within the social bond. But it has a shadow side, as most things do, because the self that one constructs for social presentation is necessarily selective. It emphasizes certain qualities, the ones that meet with approval, the ones that fit the particular role one occupies, the ones that are valued by the people and the culture one inhabits. And in doing so, it necessarily minimizes others. The qualities that do not fit the approved image are pushed toward the edge of consciousness, or beyond it. And the more important the approved image becomes, the more thoroughly the less approved material is exiled. Jung called the social mask the persona, borrowing the word from the ancient Greek theatrical tradition, in which performers wore physical masks to signal to the audience which character they were playing. The persona is the character one plays in the theatre of social life. And like any character, it has a role, a set of expected qualities, a script of sorts: the kind physician, the responsible parent, the successful professional, the spiritual practitioner, the progressive, the traditionalist, the free spirit, the reliable one. Every persona is a simplification, and every simplification, however necessary, involves a cost. The cost is paid in the currency of the shadow. Everything that does not fit the persona gets relocated, and the more insistently the persona is maintained, the more substantial the shadow becomes. This creates a particular kind of psychological imbalance. The person who has invested most heavily in a certain social image, who has most thoroughly identified with their persona, is often precisely the person who is most vulnerable to being undone by the shadow, because the shadow grows in inverse proportion to the consciousness given to it. What is ignored gathers force. What is repressed seeks expression through other channels. This is not a moral observation. It is a psychological one. The person of impeccable public virtue, who behaves in surprising ways in private, is not simply a hypocrite, though hypocrisy may be part of the story. They are someone in whom the shadow has grown considerable, precisely because the persona has been so thoroughly polished. The gap between the public self and the interior self has become so wide that it exerts its own pressure. Jung did not moralize about this. He observed it. He saw, in case after case, how the inflation of the persona, the over-identification with the social mask, created a corresponding pressure in the shadow. And he saw how that pressure eventually found its way out, one way or another. Not because human beings are fundamentally duplicitous, but because the psyche cannot sustain indefinite suppression. It seeks wholeness. It moves always toward a more complete expression of itself, even when consciousness resists this movement. There is a kind of exhaustion that accompanies the sustained maintenance of a persona. not the ordinary exhaustion of a busy life, but something deeper. The tiredness that comes from the effort of keeping something in place that does not quite correspond to the full truth of oneself, the effort required to consistently present a version of the self that cannot acknowledge the complexity that actually exists beneath the presentation. Many people feel this exhaustion without being able to name it. It is not depression, though it can look like depression. It is not sadness exactly. It is something more like the weariness of distance, the distance between who one appears to be and who one actually is. The antidote Jung proposed was not the abandonment of the persona. The social mask serves real and necessary functions. One does not need to abandon it. What is needed is the recognition that one is wearing it, that behind and beneath it there exists a self of considerably greater complexity and considerably greater richness than the persona can capture, and that this deeper self, with all its contradictions and its shadow contents, is not less worthy of acknowledgement than the carefully curated face one presents to the daylit world. The room holds you now in its quiet. The persona, whatever form it takes in your own life, the role you play in the world, the image you maintain, the version of yourself that you present to others, is somewhere out there, resting now, as it can when no one is watching. And here, in this dark and quiet hour, something more interior is present, something that does not need to perform or present or maintain anything. It simply is. There is a kind of tenderness that can arise when considering this. The persona is not simply vanity. It is protection. It is adaptation. It is the intelligent response of a person trying to navigate a social world that has genuine requirements and genuine consequences. There is nothing contemptible in the desire to be well regarded, to meet the expectations of the people and institutions one inhabits. These are the ordinary strategies of social life, and they serve real purposes. But the tenderness arises in recognition of the cost, the sustained effort of maintaining a face, the constant background monitoring that social life requires, the awareness of how one is coming across, whether one is meeting expectations, whether the presentation is holding. It is exhausting in a way that is difficult to name precisely because it is so constant, so woven into the ordinary texture of being present among other people, that it can be difficult to notice as a separate thing at all. Here, in the stillness, none of that is required. The monitoring can be set aside. The assessment of how one appears can be allowed to simply stop. What remains in its absence is something quieter and more interior, and in a way that is difficult to articulate, but that many people recognize, closer to the actual experience of being alive, the experience of existing without an audience, even the internal audience that consciousness so often maintains, the experience of being simply oneself, whatever that turns out to mean in the absence of all the social scaffolding. This is the territory that Jung found most interesting, this interior space beneath the persona and beyond the social self, where the actual work of the personality unfolds, where the shadow moves and the deeper self makes its quiet presence felt, where the life that has been lived leaves its real residue, not in the accomplishments or the reputation or the story that can be told to others, but in the texture of the inner experience, in the quality of the relationship with oneself that a life honestly examined reveals. there is no single way to describe how a person first becomes genuinely aware of their own shadow. For some, it happens gradually, over years of patient self-reflection, a slow accumulation of small recognitions that eventually create a larger picture. For others, it happens more suddenly, in a moment of crisis or unexpected emotion that breaks through the ordinary defenses of consciousness and brings something previously hidden into startling focus. For many, it happens in both ways at different times and in different aspects of the self. What is important to understand is that this encounter, however it comes, is rarely comfortable, not because the shadow is terrible, but because recognition of the shadow involves a particular kind of honesty with oneself that ordinary life does not require and does not, in fact, especially encourage. It involves the willingness to see something in oneself that one had reason to believe was not there, or to see it in a different proportion than the familiar self-narrative allowed. This is not a violent or catastrophic process, though it can feel temporarily destabilizing. It is more like the adjusting of a picture that has been hanging slightly crooked for so long that one has stopped noticing the tilt. When it is corrected, the room looks different. Not worse, often considerably better, but different. And difference, even when it is an improvement, takes some adjusting too. The encounter with the shadow might announce itself in the moment of recognizing a projected quality. When a person catches themselves in the middle of a particularly intense reaction to someone else and feels, with a slight shock, the familiar quality of what they are observing. It is the moment of, oh, the moment of recognition that is not comfortable because it requires the repatriation of something one has been, with great unconscious efficiency, keeping at a distance. It might announce itself in the observation of a recurring pattern, the relationship that always goes wrong in the same particular way, the professional situation that reproduces, with uncanny consistency, the same dynamics, the emotional response that appears again and again in contexts that seem superficially different, but turn out to share some deeper structural resemblance. Patterns like these often point toward shadow material, because they represent the unconscious finding the same territory over and over, in search of the recognition it has not yet received. It might announce itself through the body, the tight feeling in the chest when a certain topic arises, the sudden exhaustion that follows a situation in which the persona has been particularly vigorously maintained, the unexpected emotion that surfaces in a dream or in a moment of stillness, the quality of feeling that does not seem to correspond to any immediate cause, but carries, nonetheless, a quality of recognition, as though something in the body knows something that the mind has not yet formulated. The discomfort that can accompany these moments of recognition is real and worth acknowledging. It is not always easy to discover that one has been wrong about oneself, even in small ways. It is not always easy to feel the presence of an anger one believed was absent, or to recognize a selfishness one had comfortably attributed to others, or to sense the shadow of fear beneath an attitude of confidence. The psyche does not usually experience these recognitions as pleasant revelations. There is often a quality of mild shame, or of resistance, or of the disorienting sensation of seeing oneself slightly differently than one has been seeing oneself. Jung was clear that this discomfort was not evidence that the process was going badly. It was evidence that it was going, that something genuine was happening, that the encounter was real rather than merely intellectual. He was also clear that the appropriate response to this discomfort was neither flight nor self-condemnation. The recognition of shadow material does not require the conclusion that one is a worse person than one thought. It requires the more compassionate and more accurate conclusion that one is a more complex person than one thought. And complexity, honestly encountered, is not cause for shame. It is cause for a more authentic kind of self-understanding. There is a particular quality to encountering the shadow with real honesty. It tends to produce a feeling that is initially strange, and then, gradually, something more like relief. The relief of no longer having to maintain a distance. The relief of dropping, even slightly, the effort of keeping certain material outside the frame of conscious self-awareness. The relief of being, in some small but real way, more whole. This is not a dramatic transformation. It is more like the slow shifting of light. Nothing announces itself grandly, but something that was tight begins, very gradually, to ease. Something that was held at distance begins, without fanfare, to become more recognizable. More simply, part of the full picture. You may find, in the quiet of this hour, that something surfaces which carries this quality. An old, familiar feeling whose source you have never quite understood. A recurring thought that returns tonight, as it has returned before, with that particular texture of the unresolved. It does not need to be analyzed or resolved right now, only noticed if it is present, only given the small courtesy of acknowledgement. That is already something. That is already the encounter, in its gentlest possible form. The encounter with the shadow, it should be said, is not a single event. It is not a breakthrough that happens once and completes a transformation. It is more like a series of small recognitions, spread across years, each one adding a little more to the picture, each one contributing a small increment of honesty to the ongoing project of self-understanding. There is no moment at which the shadow is fully known, fully integrated, fully resolved. But there are moments at which it is a little better understood than it was before, and those moments accumulate. They change gradually and without announcement the quality of the relationship with oneself. What changes specifically is something that might be described as inner spaciousness, the sense of having more room inside. Not because the contents of the shadow have been removed or resolved, but because the effort of keeping them at a distance has been reduced. When the shadow is unacknowledged, a considerable amount of psychological energy is devoted to maintaining the distance between consciousness and the shadow's contents. This energy is not available for other purposes. It is spent in the background constantly in the maintenance of the division between the acceptable self and the unacceptable material that has been relocated to the interior darkness. When that distance begins to reduce, when the shadow begins to be acknowledged rather than merely suppressed, something of that energy returns. It becomes available. The inner life becomes, by degrees, slightly less effortful, slightly more open, slightly more capable of the kind of genuine presence with oneself and with others that exhausting self-management tends to preclude. This is not dramatic. It happens slowly, over time, and it does not announce itself with clarity. But those who have experienced it tend to describe it in similar terms: a quality of ease, a sense of being less at war with themselves, a reduced intensity in the internal drama between the self one shows and the self one actually is. These are modest descriptions of something that is, in practice, genuinely significant. The life lived from within a slightly more integrated personality is a different kind of life, not necessarily more dramatic or more successful in any external sense, but more real, more inhabited, more at home in itself. It is here that Jung's larger framework becomes relevant in a way that is worth considering briefly. Because the individuation process, in Jung's understanding, does not only move through the personal layer of the unconscious, through the shadow and its personal contents. It moves, in time and with deepening attention, toward a layer that Jung believed was not personal at all. The collective unconscious, that deeper stratum of the psyche that is not the product of individual experience, but of the accumulated human experience across all of history. This layer expresses itself through what Jung called archetypes, patterns that recur across cultures, across centuries, across the myths and stories and symbols of every civilization that has ever existed. The Great Mother, the wise old man, the hero, the trickster, the figures of fairy tale and mythology that appear again and again in forms that differ in detail but remain recognizably related in their psychological structure and their psychological function. Jung believed that these archetypal patterns were not merely cultural conventions or intellectual constructs. They were, he argued, the structural features of the collective psyche itself, the recurring forms in which the deeper human mind organizes its experience of the universal dimensions of existence: birth and death, love and loss, the journey into the unknown and the return transformed, the encounter with the dark figure and the possibility of integration. The shadow, in this larger framework, has both a personal and an archetypal dimension. At the personal level, it contains the specific suppressions and exclusions of an individual life. At the archetypal level, it connects with the universal human experience of darkness, of the unacknowledged, of the depth beneath the surface, of the night, which is itself a kind of collective shadow, the time in which what was hidden by daylight becomes visible. This is why spending time with these ideas in the dark hours carries a particular resonance. The night is the natural territory of the shadow, in more than a merely metaphorical sense. It is the time in which the collective human experience of interiority, of the unacknowledged, of the deeper and less visible dimensions of existence, becomes most accessible. It has always been the time of dreams and of reflection and of the encounter with aspects of the self that daylight keeps at bay. You are, in sitting with these ideas tonight, participating in something that every human being who has ever lived has participated in, every person who has ever lain awake in the dark and found themselves thinking thoughts they did not choose and feeling feelings they could not immediately explain. Every person who has sensed, in the quiet hours, the presence of something in themselves that exceeded the account they had been giving of themselves in daylight. This is not a modern discovery. It is one of the oldest dimensions of human experience. What Jung contributed was a language for it, a framework that gave it shape and meaning, and a place in the larger understanding of what a human psychological life actually is. Jung called the overarching process of psychological development individuation. It is one of his most important concepts, and perhaps the one that reveals most clearly what he believed psychological health actually was. Individuation is not the process of becoming self-sufficient or independent. It is not the achievement of a kind of polished, stable identity that needs nothing from the world. It is not enlightenment in the popular sense, and it is not the elimination of inner conflict or difficulty. It is something considerably more modest, and in its modesty, considerably more real. Individuation is the process of becoming more fully oneself, of becoming, gradually and over a lifetime, increasingly acquainted with the totality of who one is, including the shadow, including the contradictions, including the aspects of personality that have been placed outside the boundaries of conscious identity, and that have continued, nonetheless, to exert their influence. The word individuation itself carries within it the idea of individuality, of becoming genuinely particular, genuinely oneself, in a way that is not simply the product of adaptation to social requirements. The person who has only developed their persona, who has shaped themselves almost entirely according to the demands of the social world, is in a certain sense less individual, less distinctly themselves than they might appear. They have become what the world asked of them, rather than what they actually are. Individuation is the movement in the opposite direction, the movement toward genuine particularity. This might sound like a counsel of self-indulgence, of privileging personal inclination over social responsibility. But Jung did not mean that. Individuation does not require the abandonment of one's role in the social world. It does not require the rejection of the persona or the exhibition of every shadow tendency. It requires something more interior and more subtle, the development of what Jung called the self, with a capital S, the deeper organizing center of the psyche that transcends and includes both the ego and the shadow. The self, in Jung's understanding, is not the ego. The ego is the center of conscious experience, the I that narrates one's life, makes decisions, holds opinions. But the self is larger. It is the center of the whole personality, conscious and unconscious together. It is the deeper dimension of identity that the individuation process gradually brings into relationship with consciousness. And its symbol, in Jung's thinking, was often the image of wholeness, the circle, the mandala, the reconciliation of opposites. Individuation is lifelong. This is important to understand because the culture tends to imagine psychological development as something that can be completed. A course one takes, a therapy one finishes, a book one reads, after which one has arrived at psychological health and can rest there. Jung's view was considerably more patient than this. He saw individuation as the central work of a whole life, a gradual and ongoing process of deepening acquaintance with the self in its fullness. Not a destination, but a direction. The shadow, in this context, is not simply an obstacle to be cleared away. It is an essential part of the material with which the individuation process works. Every time something from the shadow is acknowledged, recognized, brought into a conscious relationship, the personality becomes slightly more complete, slightly more integrated, slightly less divided against itself. The energy that was required to keep certain material at a distance becomes available for other purposes. The inner life becomes somewhat less effortful, somewhat more spacious. This does not mean that the shadow disappears through individuation. That is not possible, and it is not the goal. The goal is not a shadowless self, which would be a flat and impoverished self. The goal is a self that is in honest relationship with its own complexity, that can see the shadow without being controlled by it, that can acknowledge the less admirable aspects of personality without being defined by them, that can hold the full range of what it is with something more like equanimity than either denial or despair. Equanimity. That is perhaps the most accurate word for what individuation, over time, tends to create. Not the false peace of suppression, not the brittle contentment of a persona well maintained, but the steadier, quieter, more honest peace that comes from having sat with the full truth of oneself and found that it is, on balance, something that can be held. The night has its own quality of equanimity. It is not the same thing as nothing. It has weight and depth and presence, but it holds everything in a kind of impartial stillness, the complicated and the simple, the clear and the unresolved. It holds them together without requiring that they be resolved into something cleaner or more comfortable. This is, in its way, a decent image of what the individuated personality can eventually become, a holding space for the whole of the self. Jung also observed that the individuation process has a characteristic relationship with the second half of life. In the first half, the primary psychological work tends to be the establishment of identity and social adaptation, the building of a persona robust enough to navigate the demands of education, work, relationship, and the construction of a recognizable self in the world. This is necessary and valuable work. It is the work of development that prepares a person for participation in the social world. But in the second half of life, something different tends to become pressing. The persona, once established, begins to feel less like an achievement and more like a constraint. The values and priorities that served the first half begin to feel incomplete. There is often a quality of restlessness, of something asking to be acknowledged that the previous decades did not have room for. The shadow, which was perhaps more successfully suppressed during the busy years of external achievement, begins to assert itself more insistently. This is what Jung sometimes called the midlife confrontation with the unconscious. And while the popular culture has turned this into something somewhat simpler than Jung intended, the core observation remains sound. There is, in the psyche's own developmental logic, a natural movement toward greater interiority in the later decades of life, a natural movement toward the questions that the shadow has always been carrying. Who am I beneath the role I have been playing? What has been suppressed in the service of the life I have built? What remains unlived that is still pressing for expression? These are not crisis questions, though they can feel that way when they first arrive. They are the questions of a psyche moving, as it is inclined to move, toward greater wholeness. They are the signal that the individuation process is advancing, that the outer structure of the life has become sufficiently established that the inner work can now receive more of the available attention. This is not failure. It is development. The natural development of a psyche that is taking itself seriously enough to keep growing. Among the deepest convictions in Jung's understanding of the psyche was the idea that it is fundamentally a system of opposites, that consciousness and the unconscious, the persona and the shadow, the ego and the deeper self, are not simply different aspects of the personality, but opposing forces that are in constant relationship with one another, each defining the other, each requiring the other, each being most fully understood in light of the other. This way of thinking about the psyche had ancient precedent. The idea that reality is composed of opposing forces that require each other for their existence is among the oldest ideas in human philosophical and religious thought. The Chinese tradition of yin and yang, the ancient Greek understanding of logos and eros, the recurring mythological theme of light and darkness as complementary principles, rather than simply good and evil. Jung was deeply influenced by these traditions and saw in them a reflection of what he observed clinically, that the psyche organizes itself around polarities, and that the suppression of either pole creates imbalance and suffering. In the context of the shadow, this means that every quality that has been suppressed and placed in the shadow creates a corresponding imbalance in the conscious personality. The person who has suppressed anger and moved it into the shadow may find that the conscious personality becomes excessively compliant, excessively accommodating, unable to maintain appropriate boundaries, because the very energy required for boundary maintenance has been exiled. The anger is still there, but it is not available for the legitimate and healthy purposes that anger, properly integrated, serves. It has become a force that operates outside conscious control, erupting inappropriately or turning inward, rather than serving the healthy function of self-protection and honest expression. Similarly, the person who has suppressed vulnerability may find that the conscious personality becomes excessively defended, excessively self-reliant, unable to receive care or acknowledge genuine need. The vulnerability is not gone. It is in the shadow, and from there it shapes the personality in ways that are both limiting and at the edges painful. The balance of opposites, then, is not a philosophical abstraction. It is a practical observation about how the psyche actually functions, how its various dimensions require each other, how the suppression of one pole invariably diminishes the other. Jung thought about this in terms of what he called the conjunction of opposites, the bringing together of the divided aspects of the personality into a relationship of mutual acknowledgement and creative tension. Not the elimination of either pole, not the victory of one over the other, but the holding of both in consciousness simultaneously, with the awareness that each has its place and its purpose. This is what psychological maturity, in Jung's view, actually involves. Not the achievement of a polished and untroubled surface, not the elimination of inner conflict or complexity, but the capacity to hold complexity, to be genuinely strong and genuinely vulnerable at the same time, to feel genuine confidence and genuine doubt without needing to resolve the tension by suppressing one or the other, to acknowledge the full range of one's emotional and impulse life without being controlled by it, because it has been met with the kind of honest attention that gives it somewhere to be. There is a particular kind of strength that comes from this integration of opposites. It is not the strength of someone who has eliminated their weakness. That kind of strength is always brittle, always at the mercy of the next challenge that the shadow presents. It is the strength of someone who knows their weakness and has made room for it within the larger structure of the self, who can be uncertain and still function, who can be afraid and still move forward, who can feel the pull of the shadow and neither be consumed by it nor pretend it is not there. This is a different kind of strength than the culture tends to celebrate. It is quieter, less spectacular, less easily photographed or described in simple terms. But it is considerably more durable. And it is, in the experience of those who have moved toward it, considerably more peaceful. The breath continues its patient movement, in and out, a natural balance of opposites, that too, the full breath and the empty one, neither permanent, each giving way to the other, the body understanding something, in its most basic functioning, that the psyche sometimes takes a long time to learn. Strength and vulnerability, light and shadow, the confident exterior and the uncertain interior. None of these pairs need to be resolved into a single victor. They can be held, together, in the quiet. There is a related idea in Jung that is worth pausing on here, the concept of what he called enantiodromia. The Greek philosopher Heraclitus coined the term, and it means, roughly, the tendency of things to turn into their opposites when they have been pushed to an extreme. Jung applied it to psychological life and found it one of the most consistently observable patterns in the dynamics of the psyche. When any quality is pressed far enough in one direction, when it is pushed to an extreme in the service of maintaining a certain identity, it tends eventually to flip. The relentlessly cheerful person who suppresses sadness for long enough eventually finds themselves overtaken by a depression whose depth surprises them. The person who has maintained rigid control for many years may find themselves at some point behaving with an impulsivity that seems to belong to someone else entirely. The person of excessive self-denial, who has suppressed their own desires and needs for the sake of others, may reach a point at which the pendulum swings so far in the opposite direction that the selfishness that emerges feels equally extreme. These are the shadow asserting itself after extended suppression. They are not, in Jung's view, simply failures of character. They are the psyche's own corrective mechanism, crude and disruptive when it operates unconsciously, but pointing always toward the same thing: the need for balance, the need to include what has been excluded, the need, eventually, for the integration of what has been kept outside the boundaries of conscious identity. The enantiodromia is less likely and less extreme in its effects when the shadow is being attended to, when the person of generally positive outlook also allows themselves to acknowledge sadness when it is present, when the person of generally controlled demeanor also allows themselves to recognize the impulsive and spontaneous dimensions of their personality, when the person of generally generous character also allows themselves to notice, without shame, the genuine selfishness that is part of any psyche's honest inventory. These acknowledgements do not require acting on. They require only recognition. And recognition, regularly practiced, prevents the accumulation of pressure that enantiodromia represents. The balance of opposites, then, is not simply a philosophical ideal. It is a practical psychological strategy. The most stable personalities are not the most uniform ones. They are the ones in which the full range of what a person actually is has been given enough room that no single quality has to bear the whole weight of the identity, and no excluded quality has to accumulate enough pressure to eventually overwhelm the system it has been excluded from. Jung believed that dreams were among the most direct communications available from the unconscious mind. He considered them not as noise, not as the random firing of neurons during sleep, but as meaningful expressions of the deeper psyche, as the unconscious using the language of image and symbol to convey what it could not easily say in the day-lit language of rational thought. The language of dreams, like the language of myth and fairy tale, is not literal. It speaks in images, in metaphors, in scenes that carry emotional significance rather than logical clarity. And one of its most consistent subjects, in Jung's clinical experience, and in his own extensive recording and analysis of his personal dream life, was the shadow. In dreams, the shadow often appears as a figure, a character who pursues, who threatens, who embodies some quality that the dreamer finds disturbing or alien. The dark stranger who appears in recurring nightmares. The antagonist in the dream drama whose presence creates a quality of dread. The figure that the dreaming self tries to escape, or confronts, or is overtaken by. Jung's interpretation of these figures was characteristically psychological rather than supernatural. The dark figure in the dream is not an external threat. It is a portion of the self that has been placed outside the boundaries of conscious identity and is now appearing in the only register available to it in sleep. The qualities embodied by that figure, the menace, the power, the energy, are qualities that belong to the dreamer, that have been suppressed, that are seeking, through the language of dream, a different kind of recognition. This does not mean that the content of such dreams is always comfortable to sit with. Dreams that bring shadow material to the surface can be disturbing. The imagery can be dark or threatening, or carrying a quality that waking consciousness finds difficult to assimilate. But Jung understood this intensity as informative rather than alarming. The energy with which the shadow asserts itself in dreams is often proportional to the thoroughness with which it has been suppressed in waking life. The more completely certain material has been pushed from consciousness, the more forcefully it may seek expression through the available channels. There is something to be said for attending to the quality of recurring dreams, not in the anxious interpretive mode that tries to translate every symbol into a specific meaning, but in the quieter, more receptive mode of simply noticing what keeps coming back, what figure or what quality keeps presenting itself, what emotional register the dream inhabits. The residue of feeling left after waking, even when the images themselves have faded, can sometimes point toward something that is pressing for recognition from the deeper layers of the self. The shadow also appears in more subtle dream content, in the minor characters of a dream, the ones who seem peripheral but carry an unusual emotional charge. In the setting, the forgotten rooms in a familiar house, the dark territory beyond the edge of the known landscape, in the quality of the light or the absence of it. Dreams often know something about the state of the inner life that waking consciousness has not yet formulated. They carry that knowing in the particular atmosphere they create, in the emotional tone that persists into the waking hours. None of this requires a specialized knowledge of dream interpretation. It requires only a certain quality of attention, a willingness to notice what returns, a willingness to sit with the images and the feelings that arise in sleep, without immediately interpreting them or dismissing them, or simply letting them dissolve into the business of the waking day. If you are carrying any particular dream that has stayed with you, that has appeared more than once, that carries a quality you have not quite been able to name, there is no need to analyze it tonight. But there may be something in simply allowing it to be present. In the quiet of this hour, without needing to do anything with it, in simply acknowledging that whatever keeps appearing in the sleeping mind is likely there for a reason, that the dreaming self is, in its own way, doing the work of psychological life, moving toward something, seeking the integration that the waking mind, busy with its daily business, has not yet had the opportunity to undertake. Dreams speak in a particular dialect of the unconscious. They deal in images that feel charged with a significance that exceeds their literal content. A house in a dream is rarely simply a house. It tends to be a representation of the self, its various rooms corresponding to various aspects of the personality, the forgotten basement corresponding, perhaps, to the unacknowledged depths, the attic to the things put away for another time, the room that has always been locked corresponding to what has never been entered, the shadow territory that has not yet been explored. Water, in its various forms, appears often in the dreams that carry shadow material. The dark lake, the flood that threatens the known structures, the sea at night, vast and unfathomable, with something moving in its depths. These images have accumulated their psychological resonance across millennia of human dreaming, and they point toward what water has always symbolized in the language of the deeper mind, the unconscious itself, that which exists below the surface, that which has its own movement and its own currents, and which cannot be fully controlled or comprehended from the shore. Engaging with dreams does not require a system. It requires something simpler and more genuine. The willingness to attend to what appears in them, as though it might have something to say, not as literal information, not as prophecy, but as the communication of an interior life that has its own perspective on the matters of the personality, its own awareness of what is unresolved, its own orientation toward the wholeness that the individuation process is always in the background seeking. Tonight, as you move toward sleep or rest in the borderland between waking and dreaming, you might carry a certain openness to whatever appears. Not the anxious openness of someone trying to catch and interpret every image, but the receptive openness of someone who understands that the dreaming mind is a legitimate aspect of their own intelligence, doing its own legitimate work, and that attending to it with even a modest degree of respect and curiosity is already a meaningful form of the self-knowledge that Jung spent his life trying to describe. There is a particular kind of peace that comes from accepting complexity. Not the false peace of having resolved it, but the genuine peace of having stopped requiring that it be resolved. Of having made room, within one's understanding of oneself, for the contradictions that are simply and irreducibly present. Every human being is a contradiction. This is not a complaint. It is an observation. The person who is genuinely kind is also somewhere in the full register of their personality, capable of unkindness. The person of genuine courage carries genuine fear. The person of broad generosity has somewhere in the deeper layers of the psyche the capacity for selfishness. This is not a defect. It is the condition of being fully human, of being a creature in whom the full spectrum of possibility exists, and in whom the choices made over a lifetime have not eliminated that spectrum, but simply organized a relationship with it. Jung spent his career observing this complexity and refusing the temptation to simplify it. He was suspicious of any psychology that offered too clean a picture of the healthy mind. He understood that the psyche was not a problem to be solved, but a territory to be explored, and that the exploration was never complete, never arrived at a point of total transparency or final resolution. There was always more. There was always depth beyond the depth currently visible. This might sound discouraging, but in practice it has the opposite effect. When the expectation of simplicity is released, when the requirement that the self be a certain kind of clean and uncomplicated thing is allowed to soften, what takes its place is often something closer to real self-acceptance. Not the self-acceptance of lowered standards, but the self-acceptance of honest recognition. The recognition that the self one actually has, contradictions and shadow contents and all, is a genuinely interesting and genuinely human thing, that it does not need to be other than it is in order to be worthy of a certain steady regard. The shadow, understood this way, is not an enemy. It is not evidence of something wrong with the person who contains it. It is the evidence of fullness, of a psyche that is rich enough to contain more than its conscious identity has been able to accommodate. And the gradual process of acknowledging it, recognizing it, bringing it into a more honest relationship with consciousness, is not a process of becoming better in the moralistic sense. It is a process of becoming more complete. Completeness is a different thing from goodness in the conventional sense. A person can be psychologically complete and still fail, still act badly at times, still carry genuine flaws that they are accountable for. Completeness does not excuse the shadow. It simply means that the shadow is known rather than unknown, and a known shadow, one that has been acknowledged and brought into relationship with consciousness, has considerably less autonomous power than an unknown one. It does not disappear, but its influence over the personality becomes something that can be observed, and therefore to some meaningful degree managed. There is a quietness that becomes available, in time, when the relationship with the shadow becomes less one of avoidance and more one of honest acknowledgement. The quietness is not silence in the sense of absence. It is the quietness of less internal conflict, of less energy spent maintaining the distance between the persona and the shadow, of less anxiety about the parts of the self that are not admirable, of a less rigid and more honest account of who one actually is. This kind of psychological honesty tends to make a person, paradoxically, somewhat easier to be with, not because they are more agreeable or more accommodating, but because the quality of their presence becomes less effortful, less maintained, more natural. When a person is not working hard to keep aspects of themselves out of view, even from themselves, there is a quality of ease in their presence that others sense, even if they cannot name it. The acceptance of complexity is, in the end, a form of compassion, both toward oneself and by extension, toward others. Because when one has genuinely made room for the complexity of one's own interior, it becomes significantly easier to extend a similar understanding to the people one encounters. The person who knows their own shadow, who has sat with their own contradictions, who has felt the pull of their own less admirable impulses, and understood them as part of the full picture rather than as aberrations, that person is considerably better equipped for genuine empathy. Not the empathy of projection, not the empathy that says, "I understand you because you are like me," but the deeper empathy that says, "I understand you because I understand something of the full and complicated nature of being a person, and you are a person." There is also this. The acceptance of one's own complexity tends to make a person less dangerous, in a particular sense. The person who has no access to their own shadow, who has no relationship with the darker or more difficult aspects of their own personality, is in a peculiar position. They are at the mercy of these qualities precisely because they are unacknowledged. The anger that has been suppressed does not disappear. It finds its way into contempt or passive hostility, or the particular cruelty that masquerades as principle. The selfishness that has been denied does not disappear. It finds its way into the manipulation that cannot be acknowledged as manipulation, because the self-image of generosity remains intact. The person who knows their anger, who can say, "I am angry, and I understand why, and I can choose how to respond to this," is in a very different position. They have the anger available as information, as energy, as an appropriate signal in situations that genuinely warrant it. They are not at its mercy in the same way. They are in a relationship with it rather than simply being possessed by it without knowing. This is the practical value of the shadow work that Jung was describing, not the elimination of the less admirable aspects of the personality, which is neither possible nor desirable, but the development of a conscious relationship with them. The difference between being controlled by what one has not acknowledged and being in relationship with what one has. This difference, while it may sound abstract, is one that everyone who has moved toward it tends to describe in very concrete terms, as the difference between being swept by an emotion and observing oneself having it, between being lost in a reaction and being aware of the reaction as it unfolds, between an unconscious pattern and a conscious choice. The night is deep now. Whatever time it is, the hours of darkness are doing their own work around you. The world is quieter than it will be when morning comes, with all of morning's requirements and forward momentum. This hour belongs to the interior, to the slower, more patient, more honest dimension of psychological life that the daytime tends to crowd out. In this interior hour, the acceptance of complexity is not a burden. It is a kind of resting, the cessation of the effort required to maintain a simpler account of oneself than the truth actually warrants. The permission, quietly given, for the full picture to simply be what it is, without editing, without performance, without the anxious monitoring that the daylit self requires. The complex self is the real self. It is also, in a way that may take time to understand, the self that is most capable of genuine rest, because the self that is always editing, always maintaining, always performing, cannot fully release itself into the particular quality of presence that stillness makes available. Only the self that has, however provisionally and incompletely made some peace with its own complexity, can settle into the night without resistance, can let the dark and quiet simply be what they are, and find in them not the anxious hours of unresolved thoughts, but the deep and genuinely restful hours of a mind that has learned, at least for now, to be honest with itself. The night has been moving, slowly and without fanfare, through its own quiet hours. Whatever time it is now, the world outside is still in that particular state of suspension that belongs only to the deep hours. The sounds, if there are any, are far away. The light, if there is any, is peripheral and gentle. The body has been settling, by degrees, into the simple and ancient experience of rest. We have been making our way through a particular landscape. The landscape of the unconscious mind, of the shadow, of the hidden aspects of the self that Jung spent so many careful and patient years attempting to describe and to understand. It is not a landscape that can be fully mapped. It is not a territory with clear edges or a fixed topography. It shifts. It deepens. It reveals different aspects of itself, depending on the quality of attention brought to bear upon it. But we have touched, at least, some of its major features. The shadow, that great repository of what consciousness could not comfortably include. The persona, the social face that is necessary and inevitable, but not the whole of who one is. The process of projection, through which the shadow makes itself visible in the charged reactions one has to other people. The individuation process, that lifelong and unhurried movement toward greater psychological wholeness. The balance of opposites, the way in which the psyche organizes itself around polarities that require each other for their meaning, and the quiet acceptance of complexity, the willingness to hold the full picture of the self with honesty and, gradually, with something resembling compassion. None of this is instruction. None of this is a prescription for anything. It is simply a way of spending time with ideas that have, for nearly a century, offered some portion of humanity a more honest and more spacious way of understanding the inner life. Jung's contribution was not a cure for the difficulties of being a person. It was something more subtle and more durable than that. It was a framework for understanding those difficulties that neither pathologized them nor dismissed them, that treated the complexity of the inner life as something worth taking seriously, as something that, when understood even partially, becomes a little less frightening and a little more interesting. There is something to be said for simply sitting in the quiet of this hour with the knowledge that the interior life is large, that what one knows about oneself is always a portion of what there is to know, that the thoughts and feelings and impulses that surface, particularly in the quiet hours, are not evidence of something wrong, but evidence of depth, that the shadow is not an enemy, but an unmet part of the self. This knowledge does not resolve anything. It does not dissolve the difficulties, or simplify the complications, or make the confusing things clear, but it changes the quality of the relationship with what is present. It changes confusion from something alarming into something simply uncertain. It changes the unresolved from something threatening into something simply unfinished. It changes the self from a project that must be perfected into a territory that is being, slowly and imperfectly, and with considerable honest effort, explored. Jung wrote at one point in his long and prolific life that everything that irritates us about others can lead us to an understanding of ourselves. This is perhaps the most practically useful of all his observations, and it applies not only to what irritates us, it applies to what moves us, what frightens us, what we long for, what we inexplicably resist. The whole of the emotional and psychological life, understood from within a Jungian framework, becomes information, not noise to be managed or suppressed, not experience to be categorized and filed and moved past, but information, a constant and living dialogue between consciousness and the deeper layers of the self. This dialogue does not require anything dramatic from you. It requires only what you are, perhaps, already doing. The willingness to be present to yourself, to sit with what arises, to attend, with some patience and without excessive judgment, to what surfaces in the quiet hours, to understand that the mind's late-night wandering is not merely disorder, that it is, in its own way, the psyche doing its natural and necessary work, moving, as it always moves, toward a more honest and more complete relationship with the whole of what it is. The whole self is a large thing, larger than any single account of it, larger than the persona, larger than the conscious identity one carries through the daylit hours. It contains contradictions and unrealized potentials and old emotional residues and the accumulated experience of everything that has been lived. It contains the shadow, which is not the enemy of the self but a part of it, the unacknowledged part, the part that waits, with a patience that exceeds the patience of consciousness, for the quality of attention that might eventually allow it to be known, knowing it is not a requirement for tonight, or for any particular night. The process of coming to know one's own shadow is not something that happens in a session of concentrated effort. It happens gradually, in the small accumulations of honest attention that a life makes available, in the moment of recognition during a charged reaction to another person, in the recurring pattern observed and acknowledged, in the feeling that surfaces without explanation in a moment of stillness, in the dream that stays with you past waking, in the slow shift of understanding that comes from sitting again and again with ideas like these. What is available tonight is simply this: the willingness to rest within a slightly larger understanding of yourself. Not a perfect understanding, not a complete one, not one that answers all the questions or resolves all the complications, but a larger one that includes, with some equanimity, the knowledge that you are more than you know, that the self you carry is richer and more layered than any single day of it reveals, that the parts of you that have not yet been fully met are not reasons for concern. They are simply the ongoing work of a life, the life of a person doing what every person does in their own way and at their own pace, which is the long and patient and imperfect work of becoming more fully themselves. The breath is quiet now. The body is still in that particular way that precedes sleep, settled into the weight and warmth of rest. The mind, following its own slow tide, is somewhere between wakefulness and the other country that sleep opens into. Whatever remains unresolved, whatever remains unclear, It does not need to be held with tension tonight. It can simply be held, loosely, gently, in the large and patient darkness that makes room for everything. Jung believed in the wholeness of the person. He believed it not as an optimistic gesture, but as a clinical and philosophical observation. He saw it again and again in the way the psyche moved, the way it always sought, despite suppression and despite the resistance of consciousness, to bring more of itself into relationship with itself, to become, incrementally and over a whole lifetime, more fully what it always already was. You are already whole in this sense. The shadow is not evidence of incompleteness. It is part of the whole, the unmet parts, the unacknowledged parts, the parts that surface in the quiet hours and then recede. They are all part of the whole that you already and always are. What the individuation process offers is not the creation of a wholeness that does not yet exist, but the gradual, honest, patient recognition of a wholeness that has always been present, waiting for the quality of attention that would finally allow it to be seen. One of the most quietly remarkable things about spending time with these ideas is what they do to the experience of being alone with oneself. Many people find solitude uncomfortable, not because they dislike quiet, but because in the absence of external occupation, the interior becomes louder. The thoughts they have been managing become more present. The feelings they have been deferring begin to press for attention. The shadow, in solitude, has more opportunity to make its presence felt. But when the shadow is understood, as it has been described tonight, when it is no longer experienced as a collection of things that are wrong with the self, but as the unacknowledged depth of the self, the experience of solitude changes. The thoughts that surface in the quiet hours become less threatening. They become, instead, interesting. The feelings that arrive without external cause become less alarming. They become, instead, informative. The aspects of oneself that solitude surfaces become not the evidence of failure, but the evidence of a genuinely complex inner life that deserves the same quality of attention and respect that one might extend to the inner life of anyone one genuinely cares about. This shift is subtle, and it does not happen all at once. But it is real, and it is perhaps one of the more enduring contributions that Jung's work makes to ordinary life. Not the dramatic transformation of the self, not the achievement of some elevated psychological state, but the gradual development of a more honest and more compassionate relationship with the self that one actually has, the self in its fullness, the self with its shadow intact, acknowledged, understood as part of the whole. This is what is available in the dark and quiet hours, when the noise of the world has receded, and the interior becomes accessible in ways that daylight does not usually allow. Not resolution, not answers, but a quality of presence with the full reality of oneself that is, in its way, a form of rest, a form of coming home. The night is still. The hour is late. The world outside continues its slow turning, carrying everything it carries, as it always does, through the darkness toward the next light. You can rest now, not because everything is understood, but because understanding, even partial and even incomplete understanding, creates a particular quality of spaciousness in the inner life, a quality that makes the darkness feel less like something to be managed and more like something that can, simply and without difficulty, be inhabited. The shadow is part of you. The persona is part of you. The conscious self and the deeper self, the daylit personality and the interior complexity that nighttime surfaces, they are all part of the one thing you are. And that one thing, whole and complex and genuinely alive, can rest. It can simply rest. The understanding is sufficient. The night is sufficient. Whatever you are carrying, and whatever you have not yet met in yourself, it can all be held here, in this quiet, without urgency and without effort. The psyche continues its own slow work. It does not need your attention to do it. It needs only, perhaps, a certain permission, a certain willingness to stop requiring that the self be simpler, or cleaner, or more resolved than it actually is. And in that permission, something eases. Something that has been held at a slight distance begins gradually to belong. The self becomes, in the quietest possible way, a little more its own, a little more complete, a little more at home within the full and complicated and genuinely interesting territory of what it is to be this particular person, in this particular life, at this particular quiet hour. The room is dark, the breath is steady, the mind is free to wander, or to rest, or to do both at once in the way that the sleeping mind has always known how to do. You are here, you are whole, and the shadow, your shadow, is simply another name for the depth of you. Nothing more, nothing less. Something to be met in time with the same steady curiosity that you would bring to any other aspect of a self. You are still, slowly, and with imperfect honesty, and with genuine effort, in the process of understanding. Sleep if you wish, or simply rest here, in the quiet, in the company of these ideas, and the understanding they carry. Either way, the night holds you, and the self that you are, all of it, seen and unseen, acknowledged and still waiting, is something that the darkness is large enough to contain. It always has been.